Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for the trial of Lizzie Borden, Whacks and Hacks. When Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally hacked to death in Fall River, Massachusetts in August 1892, the arrest of the couple's young daughter, Lizzie, turned the case into international news and her murder trial into a spectacle unparalleled in American history. Well-known columnists took up seats in the courtroom. The defendant was relentlessly scrutinized for signs of guilt or innocence. Everyone, rich and poor, suffragists and social conservatives, legal scholars and laypeople, had an opinion about Lizzie's innocence or guilt. Was she a cold-blooded murderess or an unjustly persecuted lady? Did she or didn't she? An essential piece of American mythology, the popular fascination with the Borden murders has endured for more than 100 years. Told and retold in every conceivable genre, the murders have secured a place in the American pantheon of mythic horror. And so this program today is led by the Honorable Dennis J. Curran, who's a retired Massachusetts Superior Court Justice. Dennis is a member of the National Board of Advisors of the Lincoln Forum. He's a life member of the Surratt Society and a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. He's the author of 42 book chapters and articles, and he has taught at Tufts University, Roger Williams University School of Law, and Brown University. So all 120 of us or so who are watching live, and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dennis for joining us here today. And Dennis, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, and good afternoon, everyone. We'll proceed to the second slide, please.
Bear with me, Dennis, 1 second.
Absolutely. There we go. And then on to the third. We'll play the third.
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
We'll go on to the Borden household, please. It originated at New England's crime of the century and burst onto the national stage, captivating the country's press and the American public. We'll show Lizzie Borden. To this day, we have an echo, Robert. The Lizzie Borden murder case remains as one of the most famous in American criminal history. Immortalized by that schoolyard rhyme. We won't need to play this one. We'll just go on to the next one. To which some of you may have jumped rope as a child, a rhyme that's been passed down through 6 generations. It didn't take long after Lizzie Borden was accused of murdering both her father and stepmother for the public to start obsessing over the case. We'll show a couple of newspaper headlines. Newspaper coverage began immediately after that hot August day in 1892 and centered on the fact that a prim, proper, and church-going woman in Fall River may have brutally killed 2 members of her own family with a hatchet. Another slide, please, for the newspaper. Lizzie's acquittal in 1893 only stoked public interest, an interest that has never died down. For 130 years, Lizzie Borden's mystery has given birth to a remarkable body of creative work. 2 operas, a ballet, novels, 8 plays, a film, a television show, 2 short stories, 4 poems, and popular songs. In 1975, there was even a made-for-television show entitled The Legend of Lizzie Borden, which starred, and we'll show Elizabeth Montgomery, please. Starring none other than Elizabeth Montgomery, whom you may remember from the popular 1960s television show. We'll go to Bewitched, please. There we go. And interestingly, Bewitched. Everybody watched that in the 60s, I think. And interestingly, Elizabeth Montgomery was in real life a 6th cousin to Lizzie Borden. The movie brought the story to a new generation. And what's the latest for Lizzie Borden fandom? Next slide, please. A rock opera called Lizzie the Musical. The facts of the case are fairly straightforward, and we'll show that Borden poster. During an oppressive heat wave in August of 1892, prominent Fall River residents Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally murdered in their home. Each had received multiple blows to the head with a hatchet. The only serious suspect was Andrew's 32-year-old unmarried daughter, Lizzie, who was at the house during the killings. His other daughter, Emma, was out of town, and their live-in maid, Bridget Sullivan, was in her 3rd floor room, resting from 2 things. One, a morning of window washing, and also vomiting following her eating spoiled, or as some suspect, poisoned mutton stew. Now, what separates this from other crimes was the combination of an unlikely suspect, the rise of sensationalized journalism, and the fact that it offered a morbid view into the shortcomings of what some considered high society. Some say that the case has gotten so much attention because the proper Victorian era couldn't fathom that someone among the upper class, especially a woman, could commit such a heinous crime. Lizzie Borden's case was one of the first trials in American history that both fueled and was fueled by mass marketing newspapers and magazines. And we'll show that picture of the Library of Congress archivist. Even the Library of Congress has an archivist whose sole job is to maintain the Lizzie Borden collection, and a whole section of the Library of Congress devoted to newspaper coverage of the murders and the trial. In the Borden case, the prosecution and in turn the media used the trial to convey the fact that the wealthy are not exempt from unsavory and violent behavior. Lizzie's defense was in some ways a defense that of upper middle class society, an attempt to demonstrate that someone from her background couldn't possibly committed a brutal murder. This storyline made for good copy, and newspapers and the public ate it up. We'll show a picture, aerial photo of Fall River. Fall River, you see, was a boomtown in the Gilded Age. Its skyline filled with the smokestacks of cotton mills driven by the city's fast-flowing rivers. The cotton manufacturing plants had made a small number of families wealthy, and the Borden family was among them. The well-to-do lived on the, quote, hill above the rivers and the coast in substantial mansions. And we'll show 2 photos, one after the other, of workers at the mill. A teeming population lived at the bottom of the hill and worked at the mills. We have a photo of the workers at the mills. 2 of them, actually. There's one of the male, and there's one of the females. The workers were heavily Irish, French Canadian, and Portuguese. And between these 2 communities lay the simple and austere house of penny pinching Andrew Borden, his second wife, Abby, and their 2 grown daughters. Emma, we'll show her a photo, and her younger sister, Lizzie. We'll show that one. Kind of an intense looking individual, don't you think? And also the Irish maid, the sisters called Maggie. And we'll show that one. Now, her name wasn't Maggie, her name was Bridget Sullivan. Maggie had been the name of the previous maid, but to the Bordens, the high-minded Bordens, the names of the Irish help were interchangeable. We'll go back to Lizzie Borden, please. Lizzie, oh, we'll stay on Lizzie Borden, the next Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden was no passive defendant. She manipulated the media, church, and feminist groups to rally to her cause and bought the very best defense team that her father's money would allow. We'll show Mr. Borden, please. Fall River's influx of immigrants fueled the city's dynamic growth, and so too did it instigate a fear of immigrants. Xenophobia, meaning fear of the unknown or fear of foreigners in this instance, whether it be today or a century ago, motivated many to suspect that it was an immigrant who murdered Andrew and Abby Borden. The crime shocked Fall River and then the nation for its sheer brutality. The murderer struck the victims at home in broad daylight on a busy street, 1 block from the business district. There was no apparent motive, no robbery, for example, and neighbors and passersby heard nothing. No one saw a suspect ever enter or leave the Borden property. A week after the murders, the most disturbing twist rocked the case: the arrest of Borden's 32-year-old daughter, an occasional Sunday school teacher she was, and the treasurer of a church mission group. Lizzie Borden was accused of parricide, P-A-R-R, we'll show the next slide, P-A-R-R-I-C-I-D-E, which is the murder of a parent. Parricide is not common in the United States, and a double parricide is most unusual and absolutely unheard of in the day. And here, if we could show it, is the house in which the murder occurred. I think it looks scary, to be honest with you. We'll show the next slide, please. The Borden family were among the very first settlers of Fall River. In a manner of speaking, the extended Borden family owned Fall River and were its leading citizens. By the late 1800s, Fall River had become the largest cotton manufacturing center in the United States. The mills, the banks, the shipping lines were all Borden. It's said that the Bordens took from Fall River, but gave nothing in return. There are no Borden libraries, no Borden parks, and no Borden museums. So let's go on to see the slide and meet the Borden family. And we'll go on to Andrew Borden. One of those Bordens was Andrew Borden, Lizzie's father, who was actually one of the poorer Bordens in the extended family. But with hard work and a miserly lifestyle, Andrew Borden eventually sat on the boards of directors at some of the Borden mills, was an officer at several banks, and owned a good deal of real estate, including the new massive red brick Borden block in downtown Fall River. If we could show that, please. Coming in, there it is. Almost. Okay, it's one overlapping the other. There we go. That's the wow, that's a huge building, isn't it? Andrew Borden was worth more than $7.5 million in today's currency, but he hated to spend any of it. At 69 years of age, Borden was a brusque and unfriendly man. His personality dominated the Borden household. Andrew and his first wife had 2 daughters, Emma and Lizzie, born 11 years apart. But his first wife died, and he was left to raise 2 daughters, Emma, aged 13 at the time of the death, and Lizzie, aged 2. She was just 2. And within a couple of years, he married a second wife, Abby, who tried, without success, to have a good relationship with the two daughters. We could show Abby Borden, please. Now, Abby Borden, the wife, was about 64 years of age. We have Abby Borden. There we go. She was 64, five feet in height, and 200 pounds. If we could go to Emma, please. Andrew Borden's older daughter, Emma, was 42 years of age and never married. And although Emma was 10 years older than her younger sister, Lizzie completely dominated her. Unlike Lizzie, Emma was small, almost frail, shy, and quiet. In contrast, Lizzie Borden, who we'll show right now, was 32 years old, cold and abrupt, just like her father. She was also, however, socially ambitious, but her father's frugality held her back. She visited Europe and longed to live, as she believed, her name and money entitled to among the society people on the prestigious hill of Fall River. And here's one of the houses that sat on the hill. If we could show that, please. You see, the hill had fine homes with lovely views, but Andrew Borden would have none of that. That's not the Borden house, I assure you. His family would live, to the contrary, down in the flats, in the business district at the bottom of the hill. It was hardly fashionable, heavily trafficked, and heavily polluted, sitting as it did in the shadow of nearby factories. Lizzie Borden has friends who were single, self-supporting, and working, teachers, school principals, and bookkeepers. But Lizzie didn't go off to a woman's college as others did, and never took a job. She taught a few classes in Sunday school now and then, but mostly stayed at home. And there wasn't much to do in that small house. She kept the treasurer's records for her church group. She read magazines and the newspaper. Her existence might not have been so tiresome if the Borden house had included amenities like a piano or new furniture to replace the 40-year-old furniture they had, or even electric lighting, and perhaps an indoor toilet. People with far less money, she thought, had such conveniences. Families on the hill, if we could show the garden party, indulged in luxuries, garden parties with an orchestra imported from Boston, and collations on their lawns. But Andrew Borden, in contrast, was content to accumulate his money, remained adamant against spending any of his riches. So Lizzie, who had neither a career nor was she a society hostess, had none of the joys of work or creature comfort. Lizzie, and to a lesser extent Emma, didn't get along with their stepmother. Her resentment toward her stepmother reached a fever pitch after her father helped out his wife's family financially. Lizzie was incensed and complained bitterly to her father. We'll show the Borden household, please. The Borden house was not a home. There was not a great deal of love and warmth that usually flows from the hearth. Moreover, the house was strangely run, like a locked ward. And if we could show the floor plans, please. You see, every time the Bordens entered one door in the house, they locked behind them the door behind them. It's strange. They kept all the outside doors locked on the ground floor, even on the briefest errand to the backyard. We'll move on to the inquest slide, please. Right after the murders, the court convened an inquest to determine how and when the deaths occurred, and the perpetrator, if any. Lizzie Borden and other witnesses were summoned to testify. She had an attorney. She could have invoked her Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and refused to testify, but she did not. Her inquest testimony was a debacle. She evaded, circled, contradicted, and revised her story as she went along, revealing both scorn and a haughty attitude towards the district attorney. She claimed that at the precise moment her father was being hacked to death, she was in the upper loft of their barn on that sweltering August day, slowly eating 2 or maybe 3 pears for about 20 minutes. Her testimony at the inquest was all over the place. Can we go to the next slide, please? She had been in the barn behind the house, she said, for 10 minutes, or maybe 15 minutes, or maybe 20 minutes, long enough for her to miss her father's murder. She was in the barn looking for lead to make sinkers for her fishing line, even though she hadn't gone fishing in 5 years. Or alternatively, she had been in the barn looking for a piece of screen to repair a window. She had eaten some pears, maybe 2 or 3, while looking out the barn window, or maybe she wasn't looking out the window. And after some time, she walked back a few yards to the house and heard a grating noise, or her father groaning, or maybe nothing at all. And she spent the entire morning alternatively in the kitchen reading and perhaps eating a cookie. Let's go on to the murders, please, slide. And then the injuries. Thank you. Mr. Borden's head, next slide, bore 10 wounds. His body was found lying on, I'm sorry to show these things, but unfortunately, at least we're not seeing the gruesome, totally gruesome stuff. His body had been found, it's part of the story though. His body was found lying on the sofa in the sitting room. And we'll show Mrs. Borden, please, the stepmother. Abby Borden suffered 19 wounds from blows, 18 on the head and 1 in the back of her neck. And that's the way the body was found. And here, if we could show them, are 2 photos of Abby and Andrew's skulls. The weapon used, and we'll show this as well, next one, was apparently a hatchet or an axe. Police found a hatchet without a handle when they, this is not the actual hatchet, this is a sample of the hatchet. They found a hatchet without a handle, police found it, when they searched the Borden house. Let's move on to the judges at the case. First one is, we'll see Chief Justice Mason. Actually, at the time, you weren't tried by, you were tried by a panel of 3 judges. I mean, murder trials were extremely infrequent in the 1893. So it was this judge, Chief Justice Mason, and then 2 other judges to follow, whose photos we'll show, Judges Blodgett and Dewey. There you go. Now, Chief Justice Mason had 3 daughters himself, all of whom were about the same age as Lizzie Borden. Justice Blodgett had 3 daughters also, all of whom were just a few years younger than Lizzie Borden. It is Justice Dewey, the last judge, that I want to focus on. You see, just 6 years before the murders, Governor George Robinson appointed Dewey as a judge. Governor George Robinson, let me repeat that, appointed Judge Dewey to the bench. Let's show George Robinson, please. Now, please remember the name George Robinson because it'll reappear in our story in just a few moments. On to the prosecutors. And the seal of the Attorney General. At the time, thank you, of the Borden case, the Attorney General of Massachusetts prosecuted all murder cases throughout the state. However, as Lizzie Borden's trial date approached and facing the clamor arising from women's rights groups and religious denominations advocating for Lizzie Borden's innocence, the prosecutorial job seemed far less appealing. So the Attorney General, Arthur Pillsbury, a politician, did what a lot of politicians do most and best. He dove for cover. He claimed that his health wouldn't permit him to participate. Instead, he directed the district attorney of Fall River, Hosea Knowlton, to prosecute the case, to be assisted by the district attorney of Essex County. And we'll go on to a slide of Hosea. That's a strange name, Hosea, Knowlton. In any event, I think it's a biblical name, actually. The prosecutor, Knowlton, approached the trial with a noticeable lack of zeal. It was only years later when a letter from Knowlton to Attorney General Pillsbury was discovered and revealed the following. We'll show that letter, please. This is a letter addressed from Knowlton to the Attorney General. My dear sir, I have thought more about the Lizzie Borden case. Now, this is the putative prosecutor, folks. I have thought more about the Lizzie Borden case since I talked with you, and I think it's maybe well to write to you. Personally, he wrote, I would very much like to get rid of the case. I would like to get rid of the case and feel that my misspelling, probably in the original, maybe in the original, might be my fault. Feel that my feelings in that direction may have influenced my judgment. Knowlton's approach to the case was highly suspect. At the grand jury, we'll go, but stay on that previous slide, please. Knowlton's approach to the case was highly suspect. At the grand jury, he even offered the Lizzie Borden defense team the virtually unprecedented opportunity to present evidence defending her. This is the grand jury. This is not the trial. This is simply to determine whether there's probable cause to determine that she has committed the crime. So the case it's a screening mechanism to determine whether there's enough evidence to go forward that the case is sufficient as a matter of law to go forward. So this is unheard of at the grand jury level. And even more surprising, when Lizzie Borden was ultimately found not guilty, the prosecutor went over to congratulate her. And we now proceed to the slide of the defense team. At first, Lizzie Borden's defense team consisted of these two lawyers whose slides we'll show: Melvin Adams and Andrew Jennings. But strangely, just before the trial was about to begin, and oddly coincidental with the court's announcement as to who the trial judges were going to be on the case, the defense suddenly and unexpectedly selected a third attorney. Next slide, please. George Robinson from Chicopee, the western part of the state. Remember, Robinson was the very governor who had appointed trial Judge Dewey to a lifetime judgeship just a few years before. It's highly curious that he was brought in the 11th hour, just as Judge Dewey, his appointee, was publicly announced on the panel of trial judges. You see, rarely do judges from the western part of the state, such as a place like Chicopee, try cases in the eastern part of the state. And the corollary is also true. George Robinson had been governor for 3 terms, but more intriguingly, he was not an accomplished trial lawyer. His involvement, although legal, was highly suspect ethically. Was political hackery at work in Massachusetts, of all places? We'll now proceed to the next slide. The day before Lizzie Borden's trial began, a carnival atmosphere-like atmosphere settled over southeastern Massachusetts. Businesses stopped, people gathered on the sidewalks, and everywhere the sole topic of conversation was the Lizzie Borden trial. Western Union had installed 30 new telegraph lines, and coverage was international. This was no ordinary murder trial. Next slide, please. New Bedford's hotels and lodging houses were overwhelmed with reporters from all over the nation. Now, at the time, our nation was relatively tranquil. The press naturally seized upon the sensational Borden trial as the story of the year. The public was hungry for the gruesome details of the double murders, and the press was prepared to satisfy that hunger. We'll show the next slide, please. Immediately after Lizzie Borden's arrest, the press began a sustained campaign of pre-trial publicity in her favor. And in 1893, the press, like the rest of America, was aghast at the possibility of seeing a woman sentenced to death, which was a possibility, a real possibility, if she was convicted of the capital crime of murder. The press also reflected the public's attitude that it was difficult to believe a woman with Lizzie's background and social position was capable of committing these horrible crimes. Next slide, please. Feminist organizations rallied militantly around her. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. In speeches, the powerful president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union referred to Lizzie as, quote, a poor, helpless child. Next slide, please. And Lizzie's occasional work for her church, shown here, was rewarded 1,000-fold. Every morning, 2 clerics sanctimoniously escorted her into court. Before the trial, the prosecutors and the police were scathingly denunciated in the press. Next slide, please. The press portrayed Lizzie Borden as a frail woman. She was not. Do we have a slide of Lizzie? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. There we go. She was not a frail person. They also portrayed her as set upon by the police and prosecutor. She was not. As the curtain rose at the trial of Lizzie Borden, the police and the prosecutors wore black hats. Lizzie Borden wore white. Next slide, please. The prosecution tried to present substantial evidence to prove that on the afternoon of the day before the murders, Lizzie Borden had tried to buy cyanide, perhaps the deadliest of poisons, from 2 different drugstores, starting with this one, D.R. Smith's drugstore in Fall River. And we'll show a photo of the druggist. The druggist is Eli Bentz. He was prepared to testify that Borden had come into his store and asked to buy the acid, but he told her he didn't sell it without a doctor's prescription. Borden countered that she had bought it there several times before. And he said to her, quote, well, my good lady, it is something we don't sell unless by prescription from a doctor, as it is very dangerous to handle. That was his proposed testimony. This evidence was proffered to show that Lizzie Borden had a predisposition to kill in the afternoon before the day of the murders. In short, to show premeditation, a necessary element in the state's burden. But in a shocking decision, the trial judges excluded this evidence from being heard by the jury. This was a great evidentiary victory for the defense. Next slide, please. Lizzie Borden didn't take the witness stand. Instead, we'll show Robinson. Her principal defense by George Robinson was that her background had been irrefutable, respectable, and that she had been engaged in religious and charitable enterprises, and therefore she was incapable of committing these crimes. Her defense attorney made a short opening statement. He began with a personal plea for the defendant, telling them how he had known the family of Andrew Borden for many years and that he had a high regard for all of them. He then dealt at some length upon Lizzie's church and charitable activities and on her domesticity. He concluded with the following, quote, "The proof that the law requires is that Lizzie Borden did it." And he added that there is absolutely no opportunity for anyone else to have done it. He said the law requires that. Now, there are two seriously wrong things with that opening statement. First, it's wholly improper for an attorney to inject his personal views on the character of the defendant. Why? Because doing so puts him in a testifying role without the burden of being under oath or being subjected to cross-examination. But more serious is the attorney's blatant misstatement of the law that the prosecution, the Commonwealth, was required to prove that there was no way anyone else could have committed the murders. Now, this lawyer, like everyone else at the time as a lawyer, knew this burden of proof. This was no accident, and he got away with this at the very start of the trial. This was not the law in Massachusetts and has never been the law in any state before or since. This was no slip of the tongue. The judges heard it and did nothing to stop it. Why? Go on to the closing arguments, please. Now, in closing arguments, the defense goes first. So we return to that portion of the trial. We'll show the sketch of George Robinson. Now, whatever George Robinson, the defense attorney, lacked in professional skills as a trial lawyer, he made up for in showmanship. Next slide, please. He cast himself in the role of the country lawyer, confiding in 12 true blue Americans, calling upon the noble causes of patriotism, God, motherhood, the protection of womanhood, the sanctity of the home, and incidentally, the acquittal of Lizzie Borden. He had, during the trial, established a close rapport with the jury. He used rhetoric, bombast, poetry, threats, pleas, and a gross distortion of the evidence. The facts Robinson told him were loose, but his grip on the country jury was tight. Robinson argued that it would be morally and physically impossible for Lizzie Borden to have committed these crimes. Next slide, please. He denounced the Fall River Police Department for discourtesy and having the audacity to question Lizzie on the day of the murder. Of course, she's the only one there. What else are they supposed to do? He stressed the absence of blood on Lizzie's person and clothing immediately after the murders were discovered, but ignored the fact, conveniently, that Lizzie had significant time after the murders to dispose of or hide any bloody clothing. And please remember that this was a century ago. There was no DNA. Next slide, please. He referred to the handleless hatchet shown here. This is the actual hatchet that was people suspect was used. Medical experts had testified that that hatchet's ending fitted accurately into the skulls of both Mr. and Mrs. Borden, saying, this is what Robinson said. Next slide. Robinson's closing said, This is an Underhill hatchet made by the Underhill Manufacturing Company. Thousands of these were made and sold. You and I remember them as boys. And I must remind you that in those days in 1893, it was an all-male jury. So Robinson's years of political speechifying served him well. He played the jury like musical instruments. He was sentimental, maudlin, humorous at times. He was a country lawyer that day, and in whom the jury could trust and believe. And they did. Next slide, please. Hosea Knowlton. Prosecutor Hosea Knowlton's closing argument was short and apologetic. He began with a lengthy tribute to the defendant, Lizzie Borden, as a, quote, Christian woman with the rank of lady, the equal of your wife and mine, a woman we believed was incapable of such a crime. I do not underestimate, he continued, the strength of a good Christian character. The prisoner is a woman, one of a sex all high-minded men revere and all generous men love. Although Knowlton's closing argument was not entirely defense-oriented, it was half-hearted at best. For example, listen to this surprising statement. He said, quote, "It is scarcely worthwhile to recapitulate the evidence. I will not do it." In saying that, he surrendered the whole purpose of a closing argument. And later, during his argument, Knowlton made this astonishing statement, quote, "I should be slow to believe Lizzie Borden killed her father. I hope she did not." As to the hatchet without a handle, Knowlton did stress that the 3.5-inch blade fitted each wound. And he did, in his most effective part of his argument, point out that it was absurd that the victims were victims of an intruder. In doing so, we'll go to the next slide, he described the actions of an imaginary intruder with these words. I think we have the prosecutor's closing argument somewhere. There we go. He came into the house where there was no chance to get in, and he's giving the jury a scenario of this alleged mysterious intruder. He hid in the closets where no blood was found. He went from room to room where no traces of blood were found in passageways or stairs. He came out when there was no opportunity without being seen by all the world. That unknown assassin who knew all the ins and outs of the family, knew the maid was going upstairs when she didn't know it herself, and who knew that Lizzie was going to the barn when she didn't know herself, who knew that Mrs. Borden would be up there dusting the guest room when no other person could have foreseen it, et cetera, et cetera. It is a decent argument in that respect. Now, after he ended, the Chief Justice, in accordance with the law of Massachusetts, asked Lizzie Borden if she would like to say anything. She said, "I'm innocent. I leave it to my counsel to speak for me." Those 13 words were the only words spoken by Lizzie Borden in one of the most spectacular trials of American history. Now we go on to the judge's charge. After the closing arguments of counsel, the trial judge, and there she is saying that she has nothing to say. After the closing arguments of counsel, the trial judge instructs the jury on the law. Go to the preceding slide, please. Now, in doing so, it is forbidden for a judge to express his personal opinion on the guilt or innocence of the defendant. It's forbidden for a judge to do so, but that's exactly what happened. Putting it another way, next slide, please. The trial judge placed his thumb on the scales of justice. Slide of Judge Dewey. Judge Dewey, who was appointed to the bench for life by the very defense attorney who was arguing before him, unmistakably reveals his opinion that the jury should acquit Lizzie Borden. After the trial was over, a colleague of Judge Dewey's on the bench, another judge, in a most unusual move, openly criticized Judge Dewey, calling his jury instructions or jury charge, quote, a more effective argument in favor of Lizzie Borden than that delivered by her own defense attorney. He further declared it was not the prisoner, but the Commonwealth that didn't get a fair trial. This is said by a judge, colleague of Judge Dewey's. Now, generations later, in the 1970s, another respected Massachusetts judge, Robert Sullivan, whose book is behind me on my right, your left, stage left, he studied that trial transcript, and he found Judge Dewey's charge to be a loud and clear instruction to the jury to find her not guilty. He highlighted 5 separate miscarriages of justice, of which we'll examine 3 now. Here is what Judge Dewey said. Next slide, please. First, as to Lizzie's character, the judge said, the government has conceded that the defendant's character has been good and has been one of active benevolence and religious and charitable work. Her character may raise a reasonable doubt of a defendant's guilt, even in the face of strongly incriminating circumstances. Imagine. I've never heard of such a thing said by any judge. I don't think it's ever, I don't know. I'm sure it's possible, but next slide too. The second thing that the judge did, he even invented a scenario of the possibility of another murder. He told the jury to, quote, consider the possibility of there being another assassin than herself. What the judge did wrong was wrong both legally and ethically. And next slide. And third, as to Lizzie Borden's numerous inconsistent statements to her whereabouts and actions at the time of the murder, incredibly, this is what the judge said. All admissions by the defendant ought to be received with great care. Such evidence is subject to much imperfection and mistake. So ended this debacle of a jury instruction. Even newspaper reporters were stunned. The dean of reporters at the time, whose trial coverage had virtually canonized Lizzie Borden, couldn't stomach this charge. He wrote a scathing story that was headlined, next slide, please. Judge's charge was remarkable. It was a plea for the innocent. Had the judge been the senior counsel for defense making a closing plea for the defendant, couldn't have done a better job. Defense attorneys Robinson's improper, misleading, and purposely deceptive closing argument, capped by Judge Dewey's ethically challenged jury charge, sealed the fate of Lizzie Borden. The jury retired and took a vote. Then they waited an hour and a half to make the deliberations look respectable. Thousands crowded the New Bedford courthouse waiting for the verdict. Not guilty. The verdict was rendered despite evidence that Lizzie Borden burned a dress just a few days after the murders, a fact that was admitted even by the defense. It was a dress that had only been 10 weeks old, and that action in burning it and destroying it was wholly inconsistent with the frugality of the Borden family. Next slide, please. There were 2 significant evidentiary rulings made by the court during the trial that were highly favorable to the defendant. And each of these rulings delivered a staggering blow to the prosecution, as the next slide reveals. The first was the judge's decision to exclude incriminating statements made by Lizzie Borden at the inquest under oath, held just 5 days after the murders. And the second was the exclusion of all evidence relating to the purchase of cyanide or the attempted purchase of cyanide made by Lizzie Borden on the afternoon of the day before the murders. Next slide, please. Immediately after her acquittal, the nation's press rejoiced. They hailed, previous slide. Immediately after acquittal, the newspapers hailed the jury's verdict and congratulatory messages flooded in. Exultation reigned, and the newspapers ran headlines such as these. A day of sunshine for Lizzie, back in her own home. Friends warmly welcome Lizzie home. Church and charity may claim her. Incredibly and irresponsibly, even Judge Dewey got into the act when he publicly stated, next slide, quote, "I am perfectly satisfied with the verdict." But then, a week after the verdict, the press suddenly turned against Lizzie. The irrationality of the verdict suddenly dawned on people. If Lizzie Borden didn't kill her father and wife and his wife, who did? Press began to have second thoughts. The Providence Journal, which was the leading newspaper in the Fall River area, ran a lead editorial that challenged Lizzie Borden, and they wrote, quote, "There is no reason now for Lizzie Borden's silence. Let her speak." Suddenly, a deluge of protest against the verdict resulted. The responsible press swung into line with expressions of disappointment. Intelligent people reflected and were finally convinced that the verdict made no sense. In a short period of time, there was a phenomenal turnaround in public opinion. The two clergymen who had accompanied Lizzie Borden to court every day had now become objects of ridicule. And so too did former Governor Robinson, the defense attorney. Public opinion soon coalesced. Acquitted as she was by the court system, Lizzie Borden was soon convicted in the court of popular opinion. And now we proceed to the postscript slide. Less than 2 months after the murder of her father and stepmother, Lizzie Borden received her inheritance and promptly moved out of the house of murder and up to the Tony Hill section of Fall River that she had long coveted. The house, of course, was fitted with the latest conveniences: electricity, a downstairs bathroom, a full bath upstairs, and Lizzie Borden hired servants, a housekeeper, 2 maids, and a coachman who eventually became the family's chauffeur. She called the house Maplecroft, with a brass letter B adorning the front door. And she and her sister Emma ate from monogrammed silverware. Well, not quite. After a dozen years and many disagreements, Emma consulted with her minister and decided to leave Maplecroft. You see, it seems that Lizzie Borden had her eye on a prominent actress, Nance O'Neill, who in 1904 was wowing audiences all over the world. Lizzie Borden loved the theater, and she went to Boston twice a month, sometimes taking in 2 shows in a single day. The actress Nance O'Neill triumphantly toured New England, and Lizzie Borden was smitten, dashing off a fan letter and asking for a meeting. The two met, and the actress was captivated by Lizzie Borden. And when her whole troupe played in Fall River several months later, they dined afterward at Lizzie's house, Maplecroft. And Lizzie Borden finally had her catered affair on the hill, complete with palm trees and an orchestra. She died on June 1st, 1927 at her home, almost 34 years exactly after her acquittal. Perhaps as evidence of the public's enduring fascination with this case, think about this. If we could go to the next slide, please. This afternoon, at the very moment that I'm speaking, the Lizzie Borden house on 2nd Street in Fall River offers 90-minute house tours from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock today. You can go down there and see it, get there in time, you can see it today. And ghost tours from 4 to 9 every evening. You can even book an overnight stay in any of the 6 rooms in the Lizzie Borden house. I should say the Andrew Borden house, 2 of which contain the bodies of the parents, and the 3rd, the accused murderer's bedroom. And you can do so for only $272 a night. And for $30 more, they'll throw in an official Lizzie Borden X. As the website says, join us to play, stay, and for a hauntingly good time. According to Borden's house manager, last year visitors came from as far away as Australia, Japan, Germany, and New Zealand. In sum, this was a case that could never have been lost. We have to wonder whether the defense attorney's addition of George Robinson, a Western Massachusetts legal lawyer, for the fee of $25 after the selection of the trial judges was announced, and the bizarre evidentiary rulings and jury instructions given by his judicial appointee, Dewey, were an example of Massachusetts hackery at work. Thank you.
So Dennis, wonderful job, folks. Let's give Dennis a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation, and let's take a few minutes of questions. Let's see here. Lois asks, what caused the prosecuting attorneys to present such a lackluster case? Was it their distaste that a woman, particularly one of her social stature, to believe that she was guilty, or their fear of repercussions
Both.
had she been found guilty?
Both. Probably more the former, but no doubt the latter as well. And also, remember, they were all married men who had to return to their wives later in the evening. Enough said.
Diane says, thank you. Gail notes that Lizzie Borden's dogs are buried in the Pine Ridge Dog Cemetery in Dedham.
I got to get out there and pay homage to her dogs, I guess.
There you go. The house was turned into an inn and tourist attraction, as you mentioned at the end. Her subsequent home was acquired by the same inn owners. I recall they later went up for sale by those inn owners. What is the status of both homes now?
I don't know the status of Maplecroft. It's a beautiful home. It really is stunning. She did a wonderful job with the place. But in any event, as to the Lizzie Borden home, you saw photos of it at the end of the presentation.
Right. Yeah. Nancy says, wow, this was absolutely fascinating, as are all of your presentations.
Oh, thank you.
Gail says, I always enjoy your presentations. Shelley says it was wonderful, as does Cheryl. Marcia says, thank you for an informative talk. What a travesty of justice.
Yeah,
Harriet would like to know, was Lizzie in jail until the trial?
The answer is I don't, yes, well, briefly, yes. And I visited the jail. It was in the basement. She wasn't. She was in the jail awaiting her arraignment. And that's really the only time that she was in jail, but she was on bond or bail during release. I've actually visited that courtroom in Fall River and gone, and I saw the stairs that led down to the jail, which is in the bowels of the courthouse. It's not in a separate building.
Paul says this was an awesome presentation. An anonymous attendee asks, did Lizzie's sister think that Lizzie committed the crime?
We'll never know. She never said anything. I think she rather suspected that she did.
Where did the children's rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Where did that come from?
I don't know offhand. I did know it at one time, and to be honest with you, I've forgotten. I'll do a Wikipedia on it. I apologize.
Carl asks, did Lizzie sell a house cheaply to Judge Dewey after the trial?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, right. Anonymous attendee asks, how was one of the three judges able to make the rulings
That's an
without the
interesting
input from the other two?
No, that's not to say that he didn't. I think that they probably talked it over, and if the other judges had a problem, they would have told him. But they sat on their hands and they quieted their voices and they let him take the lead. So shame on them.
Anonymous attendee asks, did any current DNA testing ever been done on this case?
No, I guess it should be if we want to go down there with a shovel, I guess.
Marianne says the presentation was wonderful. Lois asks, did she die with any money left?
Oh, I don't. I guess go find the money.com, I guess, the Mass Treasurer's website. I don't know. I'm sure she had a pretty penny. He had $7.5 million. I don't think she blew through the whole thing. She was a spinster. She never married.
And last question from Patty, just to kind of sum things up. Was it the money and political power that was the ultimate power in this case that ruled favorably in Lizzie's favor?
Oh, was it money and power? It was a combination of them. Yeah, right.
And I lied. One more question from Terry. What type of life did Lizzie have after the trial? Was she still revered by the community,
No.
or was she shunned?
Shunned. And school kids would go by her house and throw eggs and rocks and the like.
Lois asks, what would the motive have been? Do we have a motive?
I know what the motive is. I figured it out.
What's that, Dennis?
And I've read everything that there is to read on this.
Okay.
Her father had been molesting her.
Oh. Okay.
And I needn't go into the details about that, but I think when you have a crime of passion like this, 18 blows to the head, 11 to the and the fact that every night that she would barricade her door to her father's adjoining room, and that the father had given her a wedding ring when a child, and he was a weird dude. So that's my own interpretation, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind, having read everything, that that's what happened.
So I guess we'll end it on that note.
Well, I'm sorry, but that's the truth of it.
No, it was a good question to be asked too, and I'm actually glad that you gave us that background information there. So folks, let's give Dennis a big virtual round of applause for another one of his wonderful presentations. I thought things went very well. Dennis will be back with us on Friday, July 14th, so in about a month, but it's going to be on Friday, July 14th, I guess that's 5 weeks, at 12 o'clock, so same time, and he'll be talking about the Scopes monkey trial, creationism versus evolutionism. So, oh boy, buckle up for that one. Dennis, any last words before we wrap it up?
I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and Robert for his exceptional service to the public.
So folks, look for an email later today, feedback survey recording. I'm also going to thank some partners in that email, and there'll be information about some other upcoming programs, including the one I just referenced. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks so much, Dennis.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.